The year is 1942. The location, the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If you were a betting man in the spring of 1942, you would not bet on the United States. The American Navy was bleeding. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore had fallen. The Dutch East Indies had been swallowed whole. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not just winning. They were rampaging. They were a juggernaut that seemed unstoppable, sweeping across the ocean with a speed and ferocity that the world had never seen before. And at the tip of their spear was a machine that terrified every Allied pilot who saw it. The Mitsubishi A6M-0. It was a ghost. It was a phantom. It was a samurai sword with wings. Could fly faster, climb higher, and turn tighter than anything the Americans had. It was the undisputed king of the sky. To the American pilots, the Zero wasn't just a plane. It was a monster. It was a myth made of aluminum and death. But, sitting on the flight decks of the battered American carriers, was the Zero's opposite. If the Zero was a katana, this plane was a sledgehammer. If the Zero was a racehorse, this plane was a mule. It was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. And looking at it, you would be forgiven for thinking the Americans had already lost the war. The ugly duckling, let's be honest. The SBD Dauntless was not a pretty airplane. In an era of sleek, aerodynamic fighters like the Spitfire or the Mustang, the Dauntless looked like a relic from a different time. It was designed in the late 1930s, which in aviation years might as well have been the Stone Age. It was short. It was stubby. It had a thick, greenhouse-style canopy that looked like it belonged on a tractor. And it was slow, painfully, agonizingly slow. Its top speed on a good day, with a tailwind and the engine screaming, was barely 250 miles per hour. Cruising speed? 180. To put that in perspective, the Japanese Zero could fly circles around it at 330 miles per hour. A Dauntless pilot couldn't run. He couldn't chase. He was sitting in a slow-moving target in a sky filled with sharks. And it wasn't just the speed. It was the design. Modern carrier planes had wings that folded up neat and tight, so you could pack more of them onto the ship. The Dauntless? Its wings were rigid. They stuck out 41 feet wide. They took up precious space on the cramped flight decks. It rattled when it started. It shook when it taxied. Smelled of oil, sweat, and high-octane gas. The pilots, with their dark sense of humor, looked at the letters D painted on the tail. Officially, it stood for Scout Bomber Douglas. But the men who flew it came up with their own name. Slow, but deadly. At the time, the Japanese pilots thought the deadly part was a joke. They looked at this clunky American machine and they laughed. They called it a barge. They called it a sitting duck. They believed that shooting down a Dauntless was like shooting fish in a barrel. But they were wrong. They looked at the surface, but they didn't understand the engineering. They didn't understand that the Dauntless was not built to race. It was built to do one thing, and do it better than any other machine on Earth. It was built to dive. The Swiss cheese flaps dive bombing is not a natural act. It goes against every instinct a pilot has. To dive bomb, you have to fly your plane to 15,000 feet. You have to locate a tiny moving ship in a vast ocean. Then, you have to push the nose down until you are staring straight at the water. 70 degrees steep. It feels vertical. It feels like falling off a cliff. When you dive that steep, gravity grabs the plane and tries to rip it apart. The speed builds up instantly. 200, 300, 400 miles per hour. At those speeds, the air becomes like concrete. The air resistance creates a phenomenon called buffeting. The tail of the plane starts to shake violently. The nose starts to wander left and right. The stick vibrates in the pilot's hand so hard it can break his wrist. Imagine trying to aim a rifle while riding a jackhammer. That is what dive bombing feels like in a normal plane. If you can't keep the nose steady, you can't aim. And if you can't aim, you miss. And in 1942, missing wasn't an option. The engineers at Douglas led by the legendary Ed Heinemann, knew they had a problem. They needed a way to slow the plane down in a dive. They needed brakes. They tried everything. They put big metal flaps on the back of the wings. But when the test pilots opened them, the turbulence was so bad the tail almost ripped off. The air was swirling behind the flaps, creating a vacuum that shook the plane to pieces. They were stuck. And then, someone had a crazy idea. What if we put holes in it? It sounded ridiculous. Why would you punch holes in a wing? But they were desperate. So they took the metal dive flaps, and they drilled hundreds of 3-inch holes in them. It looked like a cheese grater. It looked like Swiss cheese. They bolted them onto the plane. The test pilot took it up to 10,000 feet. He rolled over. He opened the flaps. And he dived. And silence. The plane didn't shake. It didn't shudder. It didn't drift. The air flowed through the holes, creating a perfect, steady drag. It slowed the dive to a manageable 270 knots. The plane hung in the sky, steady as a rock. It transformed the Dauntless from a clumsy truck into a precision instrument. While other planes were spraying bombs all over the ocean, praying for a hit, the SBD pilot could look through his telescopic sight, line up the red deck of a Japanese carrier, and put a 1,000-pound bomb right down the elevator shaft. It wasn't a shotgun. It was a sniper rifle. This weird, ugly, hole-filled feature was the secret to the plane's lethality. But the Japanese didn't know this. The Zero's arrogance to the Japanese pilots. The idea of fearing an American plane was laughable. You have to understand their mindset in 1942. They were the divine wind. Their pilots were the best trained in the world. A Japanese naval aviator flew for 700 hours before he was even allowed to join a combat squadron. They were samurais. They believed in Bushido, the way of the warrior. And their steed was the Zero. The Mitsubishi Zero was a design marvel. But it was built on a very different philosophy than the Dauntless. The Japanese designers obsessed over range and agility. They wanted a plane that could fly across the entire Pacific and dance around the enemy. To get that performance, they sacrificed everything else. They stripped out the heavy armor plating that protected the pilot. They removed the heavy rubber linings that sealed the fuel tanks. They made the plane out of a special, ultra-lightweight aluminum alloy. The result was a plane that felt weightless. It was a dream to fly, but it was also a death trap. If a Zero took a single hit from a .50 caliber bullet, especially in the fuel tank, it didn't just leak. It exploded. It would light up like a magnesium flare. The Japanese philosophy was simple: don't get hit. They relied on their superior skill and speed to avoid damage entirely. They believed that offense was the only defense. They looked at the Americans, with their heavy, armored planes, and saw them as cowards. Why do you need armor if you are a good pilot? They thought. This arrogance was their greatest strength, but it would soon become their fatal weakness. They had spent 6 months conquering the Pacific, shooting down obsolete British and Dutch planes, and they had convinced themselves that they were invincible. They thought the war was already won. The pilots trust, but the American pilots saw things differently. They knew they couldn't turn with a Zero. They knew they couldn't run from a Zero. But they knew something else. They knew their machine could take a punch. The Dauntless was built like a flying tank. It had a heavy steel plate behind the pilot's seat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that would rubberize and plug holes if bullets struck them. It had a structural frame that was incredibly strong. There are stories from the war that defy belief. Dauntless pilots would come back to the carrier with 3 feet of their wing blown off by anti-aircraft fire. They would come back with the tail control cables severed, flying the plane just by using the trim tabs. They would come back with the windshield covered in oil, the fuselage riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, the gunner dead in the back seat, and the engine coughing smoke. But they would come back. They would catch the arresting wire, slam onto the deck, and walk away. One pilot, after landing a Dauntless that looked like it had been through a meat grinder, patted the side of the fuselage and said, "She's the ugliest thing I've ever seen, but she loves me." This created a different kind of confidence. The Japanese pilot fought with the confidence of perfection. He believed he was untouchable. But when that illusion broke, when his plane caught fire, he had no backup plan. The American pilot fought with the confidence of grit. He knew he was going to get hit. He knew he was slower. He knew he was the underdog. But he also knew that he could fly through hell and keep going. He knew that his plane wouldn't let him down. And so, as the sun rose on June 4th, 1942, two very different philosophies of war were about to collide in the middle of the ocean. On one side, the sleek, fast, fragile perfection of the Japanese Empire. On the other side, the slow, ugly, indestructible grit of the American Dauntless. The Japanese pilots were laughing as they climbed into their cockpits. They were checking their scores, betting on how many Americans they would shoot down that day. They looked at the horizon and saw only victory. But they were looking in the wrong direction. They should have been looking up, because the flying sieve was coming, and it was bringing hell with it. The most important battle of the Pacific War did not begin with a gunshot. It began with a whisper. It began in a basement, deep beneath the headquarters of the 14th Naval District at Pearl Harbor. They called it the dungeon. It was a windowless, concrete bunker. The air was stale, thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of nervous sweat. Inside, a group of men in their underwear and bathrobes were hunched over piles of paper. They were the codebreakers of Station Hypo. They were the unsung heroes of the war. They didn't fly planes. They didn't shoot rifles. They fought with mathematics. They fought with intuition. Leading them was a man named Commander Joseph Rockefort. Rockefort was eccentric. He wore a red velvet smoking jacket and slippers to work. He paced the floor like a caged tiger. He worked 20 hours a day, but he had a mind like a steel trap. For months, the Japanese Imperial Navy had been sending thousands of radio messages across the Pacific. They were encrypted using a code the Americans called JN-25. To the untrained ear, it sounded like gibberish, a chaotic stream of numbers and noise. But Rockefort and his team were listening. They were looking for patterns in the chaos. And in May of 1942, the patterns started screaming. The volume of Japanese radio traffic skyrocketed. Ships were moving. Captains were being recalled to their posts. The Japanese were planning something massive. Killing blow. But there was one problem. Rockefort didn't know where. The Japanese messages kept referring to a target code named A.F. Target F. Was it Oahu? Was it San Francisco? Was it a decoy? The generals in Washington, D.C. were convinced it was the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. They ordered the fleet to move north. Rockefort disagreed. He felt it in his gut. A.F. was a tiny, insignificant atoll in the middle of the Pacific. Midway. But he needed proof. He needed to trick the Japanese into revealing their hand. So, Rockefort devised a trap. He sent a secret message to the commander of the Midway base via an underwater cable. He told him to broadcast a radio message in the clear, meaning unencrypted, so the Japanese would hear it. The message was simple. It was a lie. Midway's saltwater distillation plant has broken down. We are short on fresh water. It was a gamble. If the Japanese ignored it, the Americans would be flying blind. 2 days later, a Japanese listening post on Wake Island intercepted the message. They forwarded it to Tokyo, and then Rockefort's team intercepted a message from Tokyo to the Japanese fleet. Target A.F. is short on water. The room in the basement exploded. Rockefort smiled. He had them. He walked into the office of Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. He slammed the intercept down on the desk. "It's Midway, sir." The ambush Admiral Nimitz was a man of ice-cold calculation. He looked at the intelligence. He looked at the map. He knew the Japanese plan. They were bringing 4 of their largest aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, to crush Midway and draw the American fleet into a trap. But now, the hunter had become the hunted. Nimitz decided to launch a counter-ambush. He would send his carriers to a position northeast of Midway, a spot on the ocean with the code name Point Luck. But he had a massive problem. He was outnumbered. The Japanese had 4 carriers. Nimitz only had 2 operational carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. The third carrier, the USS Yorktown, was a wreck. She had been smashed at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks before. A Japanese bomb had penetrated her flight deck and exploded deep inside. Her hull was buckled. Her boilers were damaged. She was leaking oil. When she limped into Pearl Harbor, the naval architects took one look at her and said she needed 3 months in a dry dock to be battle-ready. Nimitz looked at them and said, "You have 3 days." It was impossible, but it happened. 1,400 men swarmed the Yorktown. They welded steel plates over the holes in the hull. They shored up the bulkheads with timber. They fixed the elevators. They worked around the clock, under floodlights, in the sweltering heat. They didn't fix everything. The ship was still hurting, but they patched her up enough to fight. On the morning of May 30th, just 3 days after arriving, the Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor. Workmen were still on board, fixing the wiring as she sailed to war. Nimitz now had 3 carriers against 4. It was still a suicide mission on paper. The Japanese WWII, the Mobile Strike Force, was the most powerful naval armada in history. They had more planes. They had better pilots. They had never known defeat. But Nimitz had the one thing Admiral Yamamoto didn't have. He knew they were coming. He sent his 3 carriers to Point Luck. They sailed in total radio silence. Not a single signal was sent. They waited in the vast, empty blue of the Pacific, hiding in the shadow of a storm front, waiting for the giants to arrive. The launch June 4th, 1942. 4:30 in the morning. The sun had not yet risen. The Pacific was dark and cold. Scout planes launched from Midway Island, scanning the horizon for the enemy. For hours, there was nothing, just the endless rolling waves. And then, at 5:30 a.m., a PBY Catalina flying boat broke through the clouds. The pilot looked down and saw a sight that would stop his heart. Ships, miles and miles of ships, destroyers cutting white wakes in the water, cruisers bristling with guns, and in the center, the flat, massive decks of the Japanese carriers. He keyed his radio. Many planes heading Midway. The surprise was over. The battle was on. On the decks of the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, the loudspeakers blared. "Pilots, man your planes." This was the moment they had trained for. But nothing could prepare them for the reality. It was chaos. A coordinated carrier strike is supposed to be a ballet. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers are supposed to launch in a specific order, join up in formation, and fly to the target together. The fighters protect the bombers. The bombers clear the way for the torpedoes. It is a combined arms symphony. But on the morning of June 4th, the symphony fell apart. The weather was bad. The clouds were low. The wind was gusting. The flight decks were heaving. Admiral Spruance, commanding the Enterprise and Hornet, made a controversial decision. He realized that if he waited to launch a perfect formation, the Japanese might spot them and attack first. So he gave the order, "Launch everything. Now. Don't wait for formation. Just go." It was a deferred departure. It meant that squadrons were launching piecemeal and flying toward the enemy individually. The fighters took off first, zooming up to high altitude. The heavy torpedo bombers, the Devastators, lumbered off the deck and stayed low. And finally, the dive bombers, the SBD Dauntless. They clawed their way into the air, heavily laden with 1,000-pound bombs. But once they were in the air, the confusion got worse. The different planes flew at different speeds. The Wildcats were fast. The Dauntless were slow. The Devastators were crawling. They couldn't stay together. Within minutes, the strike force was scattered across 50 miles of sky. The Hornet's fighter squadron, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, made a guess. They thought the Japanese fleet was further north. They flew that way, They were wrong. They flew to nowhere. They never saw the enemy. They eventually had to turn back or ditch in the ocean. The torpedo bombers found the fleet, but they were alone. They were slaughtered, and that left the dive bombers. Wade McCluskey leading the group from the USS Enterprise was Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey. McCluskey was 39 years old. In the world of fighter pilots, he was an old man. He wasn't even supposed to be a dive bomber pilot. He had spent his career flying fighters. He had only taken command of the SBD squadron a few months earlier. Some of the younger pilots doubted him. They wondered if the old man could handle the heavy, slow Dauntless in a real fight. On this morning, McCluskey was leading 32 planes, 2 squadrons, bombing 6 and scouting 6. They climbed to 20,000 feet. The air was thin and freezing. They were on oxygen. They flew for an hour. They flew to the coordinates where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be. Intercept point. McCluskey looked down through his canopy. He expected to see the wakes of 4 massive carriers. He expected to see flak. He expected to see Zeros. He saw nothing. Just the deep, empty indigo of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese fleet had turned. They were gone. McCluskey circled. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. Now. The weight of command crashed down on him. He looked at his instrument panel. The fuel gauge. The SBD Dauntless was a thirsty plane, especially when carrying a half-ton bomb. They had been flying hard. The needle was dropping. Every minute he spent searching was a minute of fuel he wouldn't have to get home. He did the math in his head. If he turned back now, he could make it back to the Enterprise safely. No one would blame him. The intelligence was wrong. The target wasn't there. It was the prudent, logical decision. If he kept flying, he would be flying into the point of no return. He would be gambling the lives of 60 men, 30 pilots and 30 rear gunners on a hunch. If he didn't find the Japanese in the next 10 minutes, they would all run out of gas. They would ditch in the ocean. They would be lost. It was a choice between safety and suicide. McCluskey looked out at the wings of his plane. He saw the other pilots looking at him, waiting for his signal. He looked down at the empty ocean. He knew that somewhere down there, the Japanese were refueling. They were getting ready to launch a strike that would kill thousands of Americans. He couldn't turn back. He tightened his grip on the stick. He keyed his mic. "Follow me." He banked the plane to the northwest. Away from the carrier. Away from safety. He was flying on intuition. He was flying on fumes. And he was flying straight into the history books. Because Wade McCluskey didn't know it yet. But he wasn't just leading 30 planes. He was leading the fate of the entire war. Before the miracle, there was the slaughter. While Wade McCluskey was up at 20,000 feet, frantically searching the empty ocean for the enemy, the battle had already begun down below. But it wasn't a battle. It was an execution. To understand the horror of what happened at 9:20 in the morning on June 4th, you have to understand the machine the American pilots were flying. The Douglas TBD Devastator. In 1937, when it was first built, it was the most advanced torpedo bomber in the world. It was the pride of the Navy. But in 1942, against the modern Japanese fleet, it was a flying coffin. It was slow, agonizingly slow. With a 2,000-pound torpedo strapped to its belly, it struggled to fly at 100 knots. That is barely highway speed. It was heavy. It was sluggish, couldn't turn, couldn't climb, and to drop its weapon, the pilot had to do something suicidal. He had to fly low, just 50 feet above the waves, and he had to fly straight and level for miles. He had to fly directly into the teeth of the enemy guns, without flinching, without dodging, until he was close enough to drop the torpedo. It was the military equivalent of walking up to a firing squad and standing still. The first group to find the Japanese fleet was Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet. They were led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Waldron was a hard man. He was part Sioux Indian. He possessed an almost supernatural instinct for navigation. Before the takeoff, He had argued violently with his superiors. He told them the official flight plan was wrong. He told them the Japanese were to the southwest. They didn't listen. So, when the rest of the Hornets air group flew west, Waldron broke formation. He took his 15 planes and flew southwest. He was right. At 9:20, Waldron found them, the WWII, the entire Japanese strike force. For massive aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, surrounded by a ring of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was a fortress of steel floating on the Pacific. Waldron looked at his fuel gauge. He looked at his 15 slow, lumbering planes, and then he looked up, high above the Japanese fleet. Swarming like angry wasps were the Mitsubishi Zeros, the combat air patrol. Waldron knew instantly that he was alone. The Wildcat fighters that were supposed to protect him were gone. Separated in the clouds. He had no cover. He had no backup. He keyed his radio. His voice was calm, steady, and resigned to his fate. We will go in. We will not turn back. Attack. Attack. He pushed the throttle forward. The 15 Devastators dropped down to the waves. The Japanese lookouts spotted them instantly. On the bridge of the flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo watched the slow American planes approaching. He wasn't worried. He was annoyed. He signaled his fighters. Get them. What happened next was not air combat. It was a massacre. 50 Japanese Zeros dived on the 15 American bombers. The Zeros were flying at 300 miles per hour. The Devastators were crawling at 100. It was like sharks attacking a school of slow tuna. The Zeros slashed through the formation, their 20mm cannons tearing the canvas wings of the American planes to shreds. One by one, the Devastators caught fire. Ensign George Gay, a young pilot flying in the rear of the formation, watched in horror. He saw Commander Waldron's plane burst into flames. He saw Waldron stand up in the burning cockpit, attempting to escape, before the plane hit the water and disintegrated. He saw his friends, men he had eaten breakfast with just 3 hours ago, cartwheeling into the sea. Some of them crashed. Some of them exploded in mid-air. But not a single plane turned back. They kept flying straight, trying to get close enough to drop their torpedoes. The Japanese gunners on the ships opened fire. The sky turned black with flak. Of the 15 planes in Torpedo Squadron 8, only one made it through the wall of fire. It was George Gay. He dropped his torpedo at the carrier Soryu. It missed. Moments later, 5 Zeros jumped him. Bullets ripped through his cockpit. He was wounded. His gunner was dead. His plane slammed into the ocean. Gay managed to crawl out of the sinking wreckage. He grabbed a black seat cushion to keep himself afloat. He hid under it, bobbing in the waves, watching the battle with his own eyes. He was the only survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. 14 planes destroyed, 29 men dead, 0 hits. It seemed like a total failure. But the nightmare wasn't over. Moments later, Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived from the Enterprise. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. They attacked with the same desperate bravery. And they met the same fate. The Zeros were relentless. They swarmed the low-flying bombers, picking them off one by one. Out of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, 35 were shot down. 35. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. The Japanese sailors on the decks were cheering. They waved their caps in the air. They shouted "Banzai!" They believed they were invincible. They believed the Americans were incompetent, sending obsolete planes on suicide missions. Admiral Nagumo felt a surge of relief. The American attack had been crushed. His fleet was safe. But amidst the smoke and the cheering, the Japanese had made a fatal calculation, a mistake that would cost them the war. To destroy the torpedo bombers, the Japanese fighter pilots had become obsessed. They had all dived down to sea level. Every single Zero was down on the deck, chasing the slow American planes, dogfighting just above the waves. They were busy celebrating their victory. They were busy looking down. They had left the high altitude completely unguarded. There were no Zeros patrolling at 15,000 feet. The sky above the fleet was empty, silent, open. And down on the flight decks, a different kind of disaster was brewing. For the last hour, the Japanese aircraft carriers had been in chaos. Admiral Nagumo had been indecisive. First, he ordered his planes to be armed with torpedoes to attack the American ships. Then, he changed his mind and ordered them to switch to bombs to attack Midway Island. Then, when the American torpedo bombers appeared, he ordered them to switch back to torpedoes. The hangars below the decks were a madhouse. Mechanics were rushing back and forth. There was no time to safely store the munitions. Piles of high-explosive bombs were stacked on the hangar floors. Torpedoes were rolling on carts. Fuel hoses were snake-lined across the wooden decks. The air smelled of aviation gas and sweat. The Japanese carriers were no longer just warships. They were floating bombs. They were packed with explosives, unprotected, and vulnerable. But Nagumo didn't know this yet. He looked at the clock. It was 10:22 in the morning. The American torpedo attacks had stopped. The Zeros were climbing back up, low on ammo, low on fuel. Nagumo prepared to launch his own massive counterattack. He would launch everything he had and sink the American fleet. He thought he had won. The Japanese lookouts scanned the horizon, looking for more low-flying torpedo planes. They saw nothing, but they forgot to look up. If they had looked up, way up into the clouds, they would have seen the white contrails. They would have seen the sun glinting off the canopies of 30 dive bombers. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was not in vain. Waldron and his men had not died for nothing. They had drawn the guards away from the gate. They had pulled every Japanese fighter down to the water. And now, the gate was wide open. The SBD Dauntless rolled over, and the hammer began to fall. 10 a.m. June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean is a big place. 63 million square miles of water. And Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was lost in the middle of it. His fuel needles were dropping past the red line. His engine was drinking gas at a rate of a gallon a minute. Behind him, 32 other pilots were watching him, trusting him. They were running on fumes. They had pushed their planes beyond the point of no return. They didn't have enough fuel to find the enemy, fight them, and get back to the Enterprise. They were flying into a one-way ticket. McCluskey's eyes scanned the horizon until they burned. White clouds, blue water, nothing. The logical part of his brain told him to turn back. If he turned back now, he might just make it to the carrier. He could save his men. He could save the planes. But if he turned back, the Japanese fleet would be left alone to destroy the American Navy. McCluskey grit his teeth. He decided to fly for 5 more minutes. Just 5. And then, he saw it. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't a carrier. It was a single, tiny white scratch on the blue surface of the ocean. Awake. It was the Japanese destroyer, Aviation. Earlier that morning, an American submarine, the Nautilus, had tried to attack the Japanese fleet. The Aviation had stayed behind to hunt the sub with depth charges. Now, the Aviation was finished. It was steaming north at full speed, trying to catch up with the main body of the fleet. McCluskey didn't know about the submarine. He didn't know about the depth charges. All he knew was that a destroyer moving that fast had to be going somewhere important. It was an arrow pointing straight to the bullseye. McCluskey banked his wing. He signaled his squadron. Follow that ship. They followed the white wake for 10 minutes. The tension in the cockpits was suffocating. Every pilot was watching his gas gauge tick down toward empty. And then, at 10:20 a.m., the horizon changed. It looked like a mirage at first. Small gray shapes on the water. Then, they grew bigger. McCluskey lifted his binoculars, and his heart stopped. There they were, the WWII. The entire Japanese strike force was spread out below him like a model set on a blue tablecloth. 4 massive aircraft carriers. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, They were steaming in a diamond formation. Their decks were bright yellow pine, painted with the giant red circle of the rising sun. And they were busy. Smoke was pouring from their stacks. Their decks were crowded with planes. They were turning into the wind, preparing to launch the strike that would wipe out the American fleet. McCluskey looked up. He looked left. He looked right. He waited for the Zeros. He expected to see swarms of Japanese fighters climbing to kill him. He gripped the stick, ready to fight for his life. But the sky was empty. There were no Zeros. The American torpedo bombers, the men who had died in the slaughter just minutes before, had done their job. They had pulled every single Japanese fighter down to the water. The Japanese combat air patrol was 2 miles below, chasing the ghosts of the devastators. They had left the front door unlocked. They had left the roof open. And now, by a stroke of impossible luck, or perhaps divine intervention, the sky was raining SBD Dauntless. And it wasn't just McCluskey. At that exact moment, coming from the east, was another squadron, Bombing Squadron 3, from the USS Yorktown, led by Max Leslie. They had arrived at the exact same second, by total coincidence. It was a synchronized attack that no general could have planned. It was a miracle of timing. The Japanese lookouts on the ships below were looking at the horizon. They were watching the burning wreckage of the torpedo planes. They felt safe. They felt victorious. They didn't hear the hum of engines at 15,000 feet. The trap was sprung. The dive 10:22 a.m. Wade McCluskey keyed his mic attack. 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 He rolled his plane inverted. The horizon flipped upside down. The nose of the Dauntless dropped below the horizon line. This is the moment the SBD was built for. 70 degrees down. Gravity took hold. The plane accelerated. 200 knots. 250. 300. The ocean rushed up to meet him. McCluskey reached for the lever on his left and pulled it. The dive flaps opened. Those Swiss cheese flaps, the ones the Japanese had laughed at, split open against the wind. The sudden drag hit the plane like a physical blow. The pilot was thrown forward against his harness. The plane slowed, stabilized. The vibration stopped. The shaking stopped. The Dauntless became a rock-solid platform. Through the telescopic sight, McCluskey saw the flight deck of the carrier Kaga. It was huge. It was painted with a giant red meatball. It was getting bigger and bigger. He could see the planes on the deck. He could see the mechanics running. He could see the hoses. The Japanese gunners finally looked up. They saw the black dots falling from the clouds. They screamed warnings. Dive bombers! Dive bombers! The anti-aircraft guns swung up. Tracers started to float upward, like lazy orange balls, then zipped past the canopy at supersonic speed. But it was too late. The Dauntless were in the groove. Dick Best shot, but amidst the adrenaline, there was a mistake. A communication error. McCluskey, flying the lead plane, dove on the Kaga, but his wingmen followed him. Almost all of the planes from the Enterprise were diving on the same ship. They were all targeting the Kaga, that left the Japanese flagship, the Akagi, untouched. Lieutenant Dick Best saw the mistake. Best was one of the finest pilots in the Navy. He realized that if they all bombed one ship, the others would escape. He screamed into his radio, "Pull out! Pull out!" But no one heard him. The radio frequency was jammed with excitement. So Dick Best did something incredible. He pulled back on his stick. He wrestled his heavy plane out of the dive. He climbed back up into the flak. He signaled his 2 wingmen, "Come with me." Just 3 planes. 3 SBD Dauntless against the flagship of the Japanese fleet. Dick Best rolled over and dove on the Akagi. Admiral Nagumo was standing on the bridge of the Akagi. He looked up and saw the 3 American planes plummeting toward him. He stood frozen. He watched his doom approaching at 300 miles per hour. Dick Best held the dive. 1,500 feet. 1,000 feet. The carrier filled his windshield. He could see the individual rivets on the deck. He could see the terrified faces of the crew. He aimed for the center elevator. He thumbed the release button. Clunk. The 1,000-pound bomb fell away from the belly of the plane. Best pulled back on the stick with all his strength. The G-force crushed him into his seat. His vision went gray. The plane groaned as it leveled out just above the masts of the carrier. He looked back. The bomb fell true. It smashed through the wooden flight deck of the Akagi, right in the middle of the midship elevator, penetrated deep into the hangar deck below. And then, it exploded. 5 minutes of hell. The hangar of the Akagi was full of fueled planes. It was full of torpedoes. It was full of bombs. When Dick Best's bomb detonated, it set off a chain reaction that ripped the heart out of the ship. The flight deck buckled upwards. A massive fireball erupted from the elevator shaft, turning the ship into a volcano. Planes were tossed into the air like toys. Fuel lines ruptured, spraying burning aviation gas over the screaming sailors. The Akagi, the pride of the fleet, was dead in seconds. But she wasn't alone. A few hundred yards away, Wade McCluskey and his squadron were tearing the Kaga apart. The Kaga took 4 direct hits. One bomb landed right on the bridge, killing the captain and every senior officer instantly. Another bomb smashed into a fuel truck parked on the deck. The Kaga turned into a floating inferno. The heat was so intense it melted the paint off the hull. And further north, Max Leslie and the Yorktown bombers were diving on the Soryu. They hit her 3 times. 1 bomb penetrated the hangar deck. 2 more blew the elevators apart. The Soryu broke in half. Her engines stopped. She began to list. It was 10:27 a.m. 5 minutes. That is all it took. 5 minutes ago. The Japanese Empire was the master of the Pacific. They were winning the war. They were invincible. 5 minutes later, 3 of their 4 aircraft carriers were burning wrecks. Thousands of their best sailors, their best mechanics, and their best pilots were dead or dying in the flames. The slow but deadly planes had done the impossible. They hadn't just hit the ships. They had gutted them. The pilots of the Dauntless pulled out of their dives and sped away at wavetop height. They looked back at the columns of black smoke rising miles into the air. It looked like the gates of hell had opened in the middle of the ocean. Admiral Nagumo, stumbling out of the burning bridge of the Akagi, looked at his destroyed fleet. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He had laughed at the Americans. He had called them weak. Now, he watched his empire burn. The laughter was gone. The slow but deadly had delivered its message. And the message was fire. Noon, June 4th, 1942. The battle was not over. 3 Japanese carriers were burning volcanoes. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu. They were finished. But there was a 4th. The Hiryu. She had been separated from the main group. The American dive bombers had missed her. And commanding the Hiryu was Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was not like the other Japanese admirals. He was aggressive. He was brilliant. Many people thought he, not Yamamoto, should have been running the entire Navy. He watched the smoke rising from his sister ships. He saw the pride of the Imperial Navy being turned into scrap metal. He didn't panic. He didn't retreat. He turned his ship into the wind. He launched everything he had left. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters. He told his pilots, "Go get them." They followed the American planes back to their home, back to the USS Yorktown. The Yorktown was the unluckiest ship in the Pacific. She had been bombed at Coral Sea. She had been patched up with plywood and hope in 3 days at Pearl Harbor. Now, she was about to face the wrath of the last samurai. The Japanese planes found her at 2 in the afternoon. They dove through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. They scored 3 direct hits with bombs. Then, a second wave came in with torpedoes. 2 torpedoes slammed into the port side. The Yorktown groaned. The lights went out. The rudder jammed. She began to list dangerously to the left. The order was given to abandon ship. It looked like the Japanese might salvage a draw. They had lost 3 carriers, but if they could sink the American fleet, they could still win the war. But Admiral Spruance and Admiral Fletcher were not done. On the decks of the USS Enterprise, the mechanics were working like madmen. They were refueling the SBD Dauntless that had just returned from the morning strike. They were loading fresh bombs. The pilots were exhausted. They were dehydrated. They were still shaking from the adrenaline of the morning. But when the call came, they climbed back into their cockpits. Get the Hiryu. It was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon. The ocean was turning a deep, blood red. At 5 o'clock, the scouts found her. The Hiryu was steaming north, trying to escape into the coming darkness. But the Dauntless were faster. 24 SBDs from the Enterprise, including planes that had been orphaned from the Yorktown, dove out of the sun. It was a poetic justice. The planes from the ship the Hiryu had just killed were now coming to kill her. The Japanese lookouts screamed, but they had no fighters left to stop the dive. For bombs hit the Hiryu. The first 3 started massive fires on the flight deck. The 4th bomb was the kill shot. It hit the forward elevator. The explosion was so violent, so powerful, that it blew the entire elevator platform into the air. It landed against the ship's bridge, blocking the view. It looked like a tombstone. The Hiryu was doomed. Admiral Yamaguchi knew it. That night, as the ship burned around him, he gathered his crew on the flight deck. He gave them a toast of water. He ordered them to abandon ship, but he refused to leave. He tied himself to the bridge. He chose to go down with his ship. At 9 o'clock the next morning, the Hiryu rolled over and sank. The sun had set on the Battle of Midway, and the sun had set on the Japanese Empire. The scoreboard, when the smoke cleared, the world was stunned by the numbers. The scoreboard told a story that no military analyst could believe. The United States had lost 1 aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown. They lost 1 destroyer. They lost 147 planes. 307 American sailors and pilots gave their lives. It was a heavy price. But the Japanese? They lost 4 aircraft carriers. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu. They lost a heavy cruiser, the Mikuma. They lost 248 aircraft. But the true cost wasn't just metal. It was men. Japan lost over 3,000 men. And these weren't just any men. They were the first air fleet. They were the elite. They were the veterans of Pearl Harbor. They were pilots with thousands of hours of experience. Japan also lost its best aircraft mechanics. The men who kept the Zeros flying were killed when the bombs hit the hangars. You can build a new aircraft carrier in 2 years. You cannot build a new veteran pilot in 2 years. Japan never recovered. After Midway, they were fighting a defensive war. They were retreating. They were reacting. They had brought a sword to a gunfight. And the gun was the SBD Dauntless. Retirement, but the story of the Dauntless didn't end at Midway. In fact, the Navy had been trying to replace it for years. Even before the battle, a new plane was being built. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. It was supposed to be faster. It was supposed to carry more bombs. It was supposed to be the future. But when the new planes finally arrived, the pilots hated them. They called the new plane the Beast. They called it the son of a bitch second class. It was fast. Yes, but it was unstable. The tail fell off. The wings didn't work right. It was a nightmare to land on a carrier deck. The pilots of the Pacific Fleet went to their admirals and begged, "Give us back the SBD. Give us back the slow but deadly." They didn't care about the top speed. They cared about survival. They knew that if they were flying an SBD and they got jumped by a Zero, they could fight back. The rear gunner could protect them. The armor would save them. They knew that if they dove on a Japanese ship in an SBD, the bomb would go exactly where they aimed it. So, against all odds, the obsolete plane kept flying. It fought at Guadalcanal. It fought at the Coral Sea. It fought in the Solomon Islands. By the end of its service, the SBD Dauntless had sunk more Japanese shipping tonnage than any other aircraft in the war. More than the submarines. More than the battleships. More than the fast new fighters. The ugly duckling was the deadliest predator in the ocean. It wasn't retired until 1944, long after it was supposed to be in a museum. Conclusion history is often written by the winners. But military history is usually obsessed with the fastest, the biggest, and the strongest. We remember the German Tigers. We remember the Spitfires. We remember the Zeros. We love the machines that push the envelope. But the Battle of Midway teaches us a different lesson. It teaches us that wars aren't won by paper statistics. They aren't won by the coolest looking technology. They are won by reliability. They are won by grit. They are won by machines that simply work. The Japanese pilots laughed at the Dauntless. They laughed at its slow speed. They laughed at its thick wings. They laughed at the holes in its flaps. They thought they were fighting a dinosaur. But on that June morning, in those 5 furious minutes, the dinosaur bit back. The SBD Dauntless proved that being slow doesn't matter if you are accurate. It proved that being ugly doesn't matter if you are tough. And it proved that when the chips are down, and the fate of the world is hanging in the balance, you don't need a Ferrari. You need a sledgehammer. The laughter stopped on June 4th, 1942, and the only sound left was the roar of a radial engine, climbing back into the blue sky, leaving a burning empire in its wake. The slow but deadly had the last laugh.